Support for Disrupted comes from the Connecticut Office of Film, Television, and Digital Media.
From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. In March of 1924, more than 100 Black and white attendees were at a dinner party in downtown Manhattan. The party was organized by prominent thinkers Charles S. Johnson and Alain Locke. It included guests like W.E.B. DuBois. The goal of the party was to bring together Harlem's young Black writers with white publishers to help the writers' work gain a national audience. The party was a success. Such a success that it's often considered the start of the period that we now know as the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance saw a boom in the popularity of Black writers, just as the party's organizers hoped. Writers like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston might get the most attention, but the period was not just about writing. Music and visual arts also flourished at that time. This hour, we explore the legacy of the Harlem Renaissance in honor of its 100th anniversary. Later in the show, we hear from Denise Morel. She curated a recent exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It focused on the Harlem Renaissance. But first, we'll get a little background of the period and talk about how people thought about queerness at the time. Erika Williams is Associate Professor of English and Africana Studies at the University of Connecticut. Professor, it's great to have you on the show.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
This is a monumental milestone for recognizing and celebrating Harlem Renaissance. I don't want to take for granted that people fully understand what we mean when we use that phrase. So in the context of your work and your scholarship, what do we mean when we talk about the Harlem Renaissance?
Yes, well, the Harlem Renaissance is one of the most important Africana arts and political movements. And in many ways, it's one of the first movements, particularly in the US, in which African-American writers, novelists in particular, along with, visual artists and musicians, had the opportunity to not only really produce work that would be recognized, supported with infrastructure, but also the opportunity to have that work be commercially successful. And it's the first arts movement for writers in particular that comes after the end of slavery in the US, and after a period in which really the only literary works that we had from people of African descent were captivity narratives, right? There was a brief period after the end of the Civil War in which writers like Charles Chesnutt, Paul Laurence Dunbar were writing, and they kind of were a bridge between this period in which African-American literature was really about captivity narratives and protesting slavery, right? Really doing this abolitionist work, to a period in which there was a much fuller kind of space for literary works to flourish. And so that is the Harlem Renaissance. It is, in many ways, it was centered in Harlem, although that's a little bit of a kind of complication because many of the writers who worked in the Harlem Renaissance, people that many folks are familiar with, like Langston Hughes, didn't come from or weren't born necessarily in Harlem. So you had people coming from, Missouri, people coming from DC, a writer like Noah Larson who came from Chicago. But there was something about Harlem, right, which had begun to be a place where Black communities were building and was a place in which artists came and kind of created their own space.
I want to pull out a word that you use several times, and that is movement. Because I think often people think of the Harlem Renaissance as just about the art, or they think about art as just being art. But when you talk about centering Black creators and creatives, it's inherently political. It becomes a subversive space to say, we will define ourselves for ourselves in all of these creative ways. And as you mentioned, make a statement about allowing people to have commercial success for the work that they create that others often co-opt and profit from. What was it about this space, this opportunity, that you see it as making it political, a political movement, a political statement, and a political vehicle? What was happening at the times that made this a political movement?
Yes, really important. But one of the really central moments that kind of supported and helped to propel the Renaissance was the debate that happened within African American communities about African Americans serving in World War One. And the fact of them having to serve in segregated units. This is a question that DuBois and others debated in the crisis. But there was a really signal moment when troops are returning from war and they are demonstrating, and there's the sort of military band playing in the streets. I believe it's the summer of 1919, and this is one of those sort of signal precursors to the Renaissance, in which people were saying, we are Americans, we are patriots, we are contributing to making our country safe, right, with all of the problematic rhetoric that accompanies that. And we are also being segregated. We are being treated as second-class citizens in our own country, right? So that was something that was a really signal moment that David Levering Lewis and other historians of the Harlem Renaissance have written about. So that's one thing, I think, that drive to say, in a sense, to sort of answer the question that Du Bois posed about the notion of double consciousness, right? That we are seeing ourselves both as Americans and as Black Americans who are not given equal citizenship or recognition. And so the movement becomes about a way of demonstrating that, right? Both the inherent value and the contributions that African Americans made to the US and the fact of that value not being recognized. So that's one. But the second way I think that it becomes political is that there's also this drive to have the freedom to create without a narrow or particular political goal attached, right? So both of those things are still political, right? The desire to transcend politics is as political as the desire to protest one's unequal treatment. And I think the Renaissance artists were really kind of working through some of the contradictions that came from both of those goals, right? Langston Hughes talked about the freedom to kind of climb what he called the racial mountain, and to write in the way that one wanted to write, to be free to choose one's artistic expression, one's themes, one's content. And he talked about that freedom in a way that, we could think of as just almost approaching a kind of art for art's sake notion. And yet he said, but you cannot be afraid to choose what you would choose.
We hear a lot about Langston Hughes within the Harlem Renaissance. We hear about people like Zora Neale Hurston. Are there other writers or voices that you believe we don't hear about as often, but we should be paying attention to when we want to understand the power and legacy of the Harlem Renaissance?
Yes, absolutely. So one writer that is very near and dear to my heart, who is enjoying a little bit of a renaissance now, but I think is still underread, is Nella Larson, who's a really important writer. Only wrote a couple of novels, but they really made an impact. Her 1920 novel, Passing, in particular, has made an impact. And there was a recent adaptation of that novel into a film. It was done by Rebecca Hall. Very, very successful. W.E.B. Du Bois and others really thought that she was very sophisticated and kind of doing that work that we often associate with literary modernism, of really honing in on the psychological complexity of Black people. And she also wrote a handful of short stories, including a couple that she wrote under the pseudonym of Alan Semi, right? So she was also playing with kind of gender and other kinds of expectations. So she's really, really important. Another writer that is not talked about or known nearly enough is Richard Bruce Nugent, who happened to be one of the only out queer artists at the time of the Renaissance. And he was a writer, but also a painter, and wrote a wonderful prose piece called Smoke, Lilies, and Jade, in which he kind of captures the struggle that an artist has, that a Black artist in particular, with being an artist, choosing that as a profession, and having to kind of ignore the voices from family and community about how this really isn't going to help, quote unquote, the Black community. And he really draws this interesting connection between being an other as an artist, feeling oneself different because you're an artist and you're creative and you just want to write poetry or read or stare off into space all day, and being different as being a member of the LGBTQ community, right? So he's really important. And I think he's one of those figures that is also kind of being reclaimed in a number of different literary spaces. But when I talk to students and others about the Renaissance, even when they know it, they don't know Richard Bruce Nugent.
Talk to us a little bit about people's attitudes toward queerness at the time of the movement and how it connected to the work and the people creating the work.
Surprisingly, at least within the artists who were writing, there's a surprising kind of tolerance or acceptance, right? But acceptance on the condition of not really being fully open about it. So I think, as I mentioned, Richard Bruce Nugent and other artists like Wallace Thurman, they struggled within their own families and communities, right? Because of, again, that idea that one had to focus on the race problem and on anti-Black racism and racial injustice. Also because of the role of the church and the particular interpretation of religion. But once a lot of these artists got to Harlem and to New York, because some of the artists were also kind of moving between Harlem and spaces like Greenwich Village and others, and because of the connection to so many other artists, there was in many ways a kind of acceptance, a kind of tacit acceptance. So it really, a lot of these artists that we now kind of talk about as, oh, actually, right, Langston Hughes, big debate about whether he was or was not queer. It's a surprise for some people at the time, but at that time in which they were producing, it was not really a surprise, right? And so the question was, how much do you talk about this? And how much do you kind of keep it under wraps in such a way that in many ways it comes out in the literature, right? So Nella Larson is actually a good example. And we don't really have any sense that she herself was queer or would have identified as such. But in passing, she has a relationship between the two main characters, Claire and Irene, that is quite homoerotic, right? And that's not just a kind of retrospective imposition from critics. It's really there because other people that she hung out with, right? Alelia Walker, the child of Madam C.J. Walker, had these parties in which people were really open with their queerness. And, Carl Van Vechten, who was a white artist and patron of the Renaissance, was bisexual. So this was all known. It was just a question of where's the focus. And I think someone like Richard Bruce Nugent is really interesting because he didn't go out of his way to say, but he didn't try to hide either. He just later would say, well, I just couldn't do that. But there was an enormous pressure on folks, right, to try and be accepted, to try and make inroads within this kind of very racially unjust kind of casteist system, to try to be successful and to carry that weight on their backs as, I'm one of the most successful Black artists and I'm going to change not only what folks in the US think, but what people think globally about Black people and Black art. So there was a lot of pressure, I think. And I think a lot of, again, the energy and just the facts of people's lives went into their works in some explicit ways and in some more subtle ways. And I think one exception to that would be Wallace Thurman, who wrote very openly in a novel called Infants of the Spring, which was kind of a bit of a critique of the Renaissance. He was very open there about his queerness and the queerness in the movement.
We learned earlier that poet and treasure Nikki Giovanni had passed away. And so I've been revisiting her work a lot this week. And I keep going back to this conversation she had with James Baldwin and thinking about the ways that they talk about the layers of their love for Black people and for Blackness and the fullness of that, but also the responsibility to speak truth to those situations where it would be easy for people to deny that power and deny what Giovanni talks about as the opportunity to tell those stories and the opportunity to be a vehicle for understanding. And I was listening to the two of them talk, as prep for this conversation with you and thinking about the brilliant legacies of the Harlem Renaissance and the brilliant legacies of people like James Baldwin, Nikki Giovanni, who are facing all of these challenges, whether it's region of the country or international identity, and still created bodies of work that in 2024 are just as relevant and in some ways even more relevant. What do you see as the real legacy of the Harlem Renaissance that we need, especially in these moments where we need a language of connection? What do you see as the legacies of the Harlem Renaissance that we should be paying attention to today?
I think that, for many of these writers, understanding like someone like James Baldwin, who of course, is absolutely so connected, right? Coming of age in this period of the Renaissance, to find the beautiful way that he found to simultaneously talk about and celebrate his Blackness and his queerness, right, is absolutely one of the legacies of the Renaissance, right? And then for Nikki Giovanni to be able to give us language to address race, sexuality, identity, class, right? All of these intersecting identities, and to understand that we have to be seen as full, complex people, that we are not necessarily free, or we don't necessarily have the luxury to sort of focus on one identity, one stigmatized identity to the exclusion of others, right? And we're really seeing that, no, you have to talk about all of it, right? Even if it's, one poem about focusing more on racial injustice and another poem that's focusing more on gender, but it has to all come together because those are the realities of people's lives, that they're experiencing their lives, right? You don't stop being victimized by misogyny as a Black woman because ever, right? So there has to be this way of talking about different things simultaneously. One wonderful vehicle from the Renaissance that I didn't mention is this magazine that was started by Hughes and Wallace Thurman and Zora Neale Hurston called Fire. And this was an attempt at the sort of younger generation who felt that in some ways they were overly constrained by some of the elders who only wanted to focus on race and who were maybe a little bit reticent to talk about sexuality at all. And they were really upfront about, kind of leaving respectability politics, trying to present complexities of these intersecting identities. And the magazine was really quite explosive, and that it ended very quickly. There literally was a fire that just sort of destroyed the infrastructure. But I think that magazine, although it really only had one issue, is also a really, really important legacy, right? And part of the Renaissance. So I think that's one of the most important parts of the Renaissance. And the other, I think, it comes back to this idea of freedom, the freedom to express oneself, the freedom to figure out how to be an artist, and the freedom also and the audacity to do that in a consumerist kind of culture in which there is going to be some appropriation, and in which the success, right, the success that comes along with commercial viability can also become a liability. And I think we see Black artists working through those complications as well, right? What does it mean to produce something that will become a signal representation of Black identity, Black music, Black art, but know that as it circulates, it's going to be appropriated, it's going to be misused, it's going to be unevenly distributed, and to know that, work through it, but still hold to your truth. And I think in that sense, the Harlem Renaissance has left a really important legacy, not only for writers like Nikki Giovanni and James Baldwin, but for musical artists, right? For, hip hop artists, for soul artists, for people wanting to cross genres, for people struggling to produce art that can reach as many people as possible and carry this message of the brilliance and beauty of Black life. But also knowing that's going to come with complications, and that there's going to need to be a continued assertion of, yes, this art form is for everyone, but it is also specific. It has a history. It has a cultural context. It is connected to people, right? And not just form.
It is a powerful legacy of the Harlem Renaissance, and we appreciate you for reminding us of that legacy, but also, Professor, challenging us to continue it in the ways that you mentioned. Erika Williams is Associate Professor of English and Africana Studies at the University of Connecticut. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Coming up, a curator talks about a gap she saw in the Metropolitan Museum of Art's collection. This is Disrupted. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're reflecting on the legacy of the Harlem Renaissance. What does that period mean to students today? Our team talked about that issue with Brandon Hutchinson, Associate Professor of English, Affiliate Faculty of Women and Gender Studies, and co-coordinator of the Africana Studies program at Southern Connecticut State University. She teaches a course on the Harlem Renaissance.
I saw students come alive. I don't think the material was necessarily taught to them before.
We also spoke with two of Professor Hutchinson's former students, Jonah Craggett and John Gilmet. Both were pursuing MFAs in creative writing when they took her course.
It did not feel like work. I was so excited to go into class and to read the material.
I would say in taking the Harlem Renaissance literature class with Professor Hutchinson, I learned kind of that pivotal moment in U.S. history when Black art and culture was being consumed by a broader national audience, and art seemed to be a way of bridging a racial divide and a class divide.
For all three scholars, the Harlem Renaissance is a reminder of the importance of representation.
I think that students are eager to talk about issues like belonging, issues like where is home for me, what are the ways in which I have to contort myself for people to see me, whether that's about sexuality or your class background or your race.
When I took the class, I knew immediately that there was a place for the stories that I was writing. I knew immediately that there were going to be there was an entire demographic of people who just got it, and that there was an entire history that validated the claims that I often felt that I was fighting to prove were real in all white spaces.
One thing that I think remains eternally resonant is the power of art to communicate.
Many thanks to Professor Hutchinson and her former students for sharing their thoughts. Earlier this year, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, also known as the Met, hosted an exhibition about the Harlem Renaissance. It was called The Harlem Renaissance and Transatlantic Modernism. It was the Met's first exhibition focusing on Harlem since an infamous 1969 exhibit. That exhibit at an art museum featured no Black art beyond photographs documenting the neighborhood. Denise Morell is the Merrill H. and James S. Tisch Curator at Large at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. She curated the exhibit The Harlem Renaissance and Transatlantic Modernism. Denise, it's wonderful to have you on Disrupted.
Thank you, Kalila. It's my pleasure and my honor to be here today.
Before we talk about this amazing exhibition and the context for that exhibition, I want our listeners to know a little bit about you, because your path to being a curator wasn't quite linear, but I think speaks so much to how you bring context and nuance into art. Talk to us about your journey to becoming a curator.
You're right. The path was circuitous in some ways, but it was also organic. My undergraduate degree is from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. I majored in business and economics, did not take a single art history course, took a lot of literature. So I did take the literature of the Harlem Renaissance as an undergrad. And then I worked in finance with an investment bank for a couple of years and got my MBA from Harvard Business School. So for the next 20 plus years, I had a career in finance and management consulting, market research, a career that I really enjoyed for the most part. And one aspect of that life was first travel. US and international. So what do? You're on a business trip, you've got downtime, you browse museums, seeing a lot of art. Another aspect of it, though, was joining with friends museum support groups, the Studio Museum in Harlem, the Museum of Modern Art, the Friends of Education, or the name at the time. And those groups go to get curator-led tours of exhibitions, go to the art fairs, Miami Basel, Frieze, Art, etc., and eventually got to the point where I was curious enough that I wanted to take an Art History 101 course, which I did in the evenings while still working full-time at Hunter College. That led to, but once you get in, it just you just want to know more and more. I ended up getting a part-time MA in art history at Columbia. Finished that in 2004, I think. Was doing some lecturing and various freelance things. But then just career and life circumstances evolve. And by 2007, I started the full-time PhD in art history program at Columbia University. And so here we are today.
It is quite an amazing and inspiring journey, but I think it also conveys this thirst, this curiosity, and this excitement that you express of the ability of art to bring people together across time and space, the ability of art to be a vehicle for communicating that, but to also appreciate art as a living experience, not just something that is stationary in a wall.
Right.
This exhibit that, as I said, was powerful, was awe-inspiring. I was able to see it the last weekend that it was open, and I said, I have to get there. Having that exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, talk to us about that. Had the museum had this a Harlem Renaissance exhibit before, what was unique about this important work you were able to curate?
I had done a previous exhibition at Columbia University that also traveled to the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. And the middle component of that was a brief look at several Harlem Renaissance artists, Aaron Douglas, Archibald Motley, Laura Wheeler Waring, some others. And that triggered, the research for that show triggered the memories I had of having read novels by Langston, Hughes, Zora, Hurston, and other artists, authors of the Harlem Renaissance, because I'm seeing in these works a visualization of the ideas that they were expressing this new urbane Black modernity that emerged in the 1920s that defined, together with jazz, the music of the Harlem Renaissance was big band swing. So this was the jazz age, the 20s through the 40s. And this period, so there were a number of artists, easily half a dozen, who made hundreds of works, almost none of which went into large museums like the Met. There were HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, that did collect at the time, gave the artists a base as faculty members to maintain, to be able to have a career as an artist. And all of this was pretty much ignored. There are a couple of exceptions, but mostly ignored by large American museums. Many of these artists also spent extended periods of time in expatriation, living and working in Europe, mainly Paris, the south of France, but also the UK, Scandinavia, many countries across Europe. And so my business career was international. I spent about 30% of my time in Europe during those years and seeing the collections there and learning the history from that end. So all of this cumulative experience just led me to see a gaping hole in the Met's collection as a museum that expressed itself or described itself as an encyclopedic museum.
What were some of the themes as you were putting together? I don't even know how you decide, right? There's so many options how you decide. What were some of those themes within the visual art space that you saw and you wanted to make sure were conveyed in this exhibit?
Yes. Well, I think the writers of the time, the leading writers of the time, W.E.B. DuBois, Zora Neale Hurston, Alain Locke, and it was Alain Locke, a Howard University philosophy professor, who wrote the book The New Negro, published in 1925, that gave the movement the name that it was known as at the time. Harlem Renaissance was somewhat retroactive. And the idea of the new Negro was that this is the moment in history where we are going to define ourselves. And Langston Hughes had this famous, widely quoted saying, if people like it, he specifically said, if white folks like it, good. If they don't, that's okay. If Black folks like it, he's talking about the rising Black middle class, okay. But if they don't, that's okay too. We are going to ascend to the mountain, to the top of the mountain, free in ourselves, and present our culture as on par with anything else, everything else that's happened in history and at this particular moment in history. And that was what played out in the images that the artists represented. And the artists and writers, as well as musicians, Duke Ellington, the singers, all knew each other. And so it was a community that took shape in New York, specifically Harlem, but these folks were from all over the country: Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., Oakland, points in between, and points to the South. And so they had heated debates about just what this, mode of Black self-expression would look like. There were artists like Archibald Motley from Chicago, Laura Wheeler Waring from Philadelphia, who wanted to convey dignity and historical gravitas. So you may remember the larger-than-life portrait of Marian Anderson, one of the most popular works in the show. And her view was that this painting was made specifically for the National Portrait Gallery. There were almost no portraits of Black luminaries presented with the same qualities of dignity, elegance, historical gravitas as the portraits of the first ladies, the presidents, the writers, thinkers of the period. So she wanted to use a classical style to do that. But then you had Aaron Douglas and Charles Alston and other artists who looked to the ancestral legacy, wanted to reclaim the ancestral legacy of African art. So the mask aesthetic, the expressive, non-naturalistic treatment of the figure was a big part of how they worked. So you had these disparate styles, but what they had in common was that they were going to remake the image of Black America according to cultural values defined by Black Americans themselves.
You're listening to my interview with Denise Morel. She curated an exhibit about the Harlem Renaissance at the Metropolitan Museum of Art earlier this year. Coming up, Denise Morel will talk about the response to the exhibit. This is Disrupted. Stay with us. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're talking about the Harlem Renaissance and what it means today. I'm joined by Denise Morel. Earlier this year, she curated the exhibit The Harlem Renaissance and Transatlantic Modernism at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I was fortunate to see that exhibition on a busy Friday night, and it happened to be the last weekend of the exhibition's run this summer. As someone who reveres the Harlem Renaissance and thought I knew a lot about the period, it felt different to walk through that exhibition and to feel the power of the art that it contained. One of the pieces that stopped me in my tracks was by Laura Wheeler Waring. Although Waring later lived in Philadelphia, she was born in Hartford and educated in Hartford public schools. The piece that I fell in love with was called Girl in Pink Dress. It's a painting of a girl sitting in a pink dress while looking off to the side. There's a beautiful, ornate floral decoration on her shoulder. And what struck me about this painting were all the subtle layers of beauty. The posture of the person in the picture, her detailed clothing, the ways that the artist shows this beauty, but also the dignity. When I mentioned that painting, Denise Morel immediately lit up and jumped in.
But also she was an icon of that particular period of the Jazz age, the short cropped marceled bob, the coiffure, her hairstyle, the long waisted, that ornate pink dress was long waisted with a bouffant skirt and a gorgeously depicted ornament on one shoulder. These were images that were the covers of magazines, fashion news, and other magazines of the period, but there were almost no Black woman shown in those contexts, unless they were performers on occasion. But the clubs and the cafes and the tea rooms and the movie halls of the period were very much populated by Black men and women just every day. On the one hand, I wish and I hope that we can eventually determine the name of the sitter for Pink Dress. But on the other hand, the fact that she doesn't have to be named because she's every woman. She's an icon of the period, and she represents the significant Black presence during that period in a way that the popular culture and the prevailing artists of the period did not represent. You were not alone. Many people, many women, but families, people told me how they took their children over to see that painting. The admiration for the dignity, the elegance, the beauty.
And there's a timeless elegance to that. I saw that exhibit with my 16-year-old daughter, who purchased her first print of Girl in Pink Dress because she was so captured by it to say, why don't we see more images like this? When we're talking about the Harlem Renaissance, why isn't Laura Wheeler wearing a name that many people know who aren't sort of, singularly versed in the breadth of this and complexity? And to hear you talk about the intentional inclusion of this to be able to do that, I think is powerful. The other thing I want to make sure that we mention is you talked about how these artists transcended the boundaries of the United States and America. And so they are creating this art that is seen in Europe and all across the world. And to talk about the new Negro, it is creating a new international image and dignity for Black people. How important was that transatlantic expression of the Harlem Renaissance?
It was essential. It was necessary for Black artists, to some extent for artists in general, during the 20s through the 40s, the run up to World War II. Paris was the art capital of the world, and many other American artists from all over the world, went to Paris. But I think it was especially liberating for African American artists who were, for the most part, due to segregated racial policies by American museums and galleries and so forth, they just were not getting the same opportunities as their successful white peers in the US. But they could go to Paris. Many of them had served in World War II, so they had the GI Bill, or they won grants, Fulbright scholarships, and others means of support. So they were able to go there for a year, for a decade, and feel the freedom. Many of them wrote about feeling that for the first time in their lives, their ethnicity, their racial identity was not foremost. They were free to be artists. Now, there's also, it's worth noting that there is, to counterbalance that, many of the artists, and especially the writers, W.E.B. DuBois, were aware that Paris was also the capital of the French Empire, that had imposed certain, an oppressively racist regime in the Caribbean and West Africa and so forth. And so part of this this new international identity was forming alliances with the anti-colonial movements of Black French, Black British, Black Dutch artists and writers in the early 1920s, and European artists. Many of them had collaborations with European artists. Picasso, Matisse looked at, on the one hand, they were looking at African art just as the new Negro artists were, but they were also looking at African American jazz, and they were looking at the cultural expressions of African America and reflecting that in very dignified portraits of people of color that these famous European artists were making. So Alain Locke, one of his dreams, and he was never able to achieve it, was to do the types of shows that bring together Black American, Black and white European, any artist who is making dignified, modernizing portrayals of the Black subject would be considered to be a cohort. So he wanted to do shows that combine Black and white artists, American and European, the way that I did in my show. He was not able to because of the racial policies of American museums. So I felt that in doing this at the Met, and especially at the Met, which had been one of the enforcers of this segregated policy in the past, I was fulfilling a vision, one of the visions of luminaries like Alain Locke and W.E.B. DuBois that they were not able to achieve in their own time.
I think about where we are right now, where Black dignity, Black excellence, Black humanity seem to be attacked in so many ways. And for you to curate this exhibit to, one, pay tribute and honor the artists of the Harlem Renaissance, but to also compel us to pause in a moment and reflect, it is an awesome opportunity and then in some ways an awesome responsibility and weight. What was the reaction to the exhibit once it came to life?
Yes, and I should say that I very much felt that responsibility. And this is where in my background, the fact that I came to art, just like many people do, is kind of an avocation. You have a full-time life doing something else, but then you fall in love with this. But I could see the gaps, okay? I could see that American history, world history, was being presented as one created and occupied by non-Black people. So the last this was the first exhibition about the Harlem Renaissance, group show in New York City in almost 40 years. And so many scholars, professors who have studied and written master's theses and doctoral dissertations on the Harlem Renaissance told me that they had never seen all of these works together in person. So that was meaningful. But equally and probably long-term, more importantly, the show drew one of the largest audiences of the year to the Met, over 400,000, and one of the most diverse audiences. Part of why museums like the Met had hesitated to do these shows before was they felt that it didn't appeal to the museum-going public. But what we have been saying is, well, if you show works that in which the broad population sees itself, then these shows can expand the museum-going public. We want to get everybody who's already coming to the Met to come see it, and high percentages of those folks certainly did, and that was fantastic. But we did have people coming to the Met who don't normally come to the Met, and they came back repeatedly. Someone would come see it and then come back with their grandmother or their children or their sorority sisters, and I felt vindicated that we had shown that these topics are not marginal. They are central to the way a multicultural society like the United States should be looking at its history and its art history.
What do you hope is the takeaway from this exhibit about the Harlem Renaissance, but more broadly, the Harlem Renaissance as a movement? What do you hope people take away?
Well, what I hope is that we will come to think of American history, this pre-World War II period, the 19 teens through the 1940s. We'll think about the great artists that we currently know about that are taught in American art history courses, from Hopper and Stieglitz and Georgia O'Keeffe. We should see Aaron Douglas and Archibald Motley and Charles Alston, Laura Wheeler Waring, Meta Warwick Fuller. These names should be on the set, treated, seen as central to the period as the artists that we already know about. It was interesting for me, some of the reaction from within the museum. A board member that I hosted for a private visit said that he saw more great artists that he'd never heard of before in this show than any other show. People usually go to see a Manet Degas or a Warhol show because they know about the artist. They want to know more. And that was backed up statistically. Our marketing people surveyed people coming into the show, and only 18% could name an artist in the show before they saw the show. 38% could name a writer, and that writer was Langston Hughes. So clearly he's the icon of the movement. But so that means there's tremendous opportunity for growth and education, and for pulling in a much broader public to the extent that we continue to present this material. So just from my micro perspective as a curator, one of the things that I want to do, so many people said, well, I just missed it, or I want to come back, I want to bring a student group or a Sunday school group, or so how, if I were to come back this fall after the show closes, what would we be able to see? And that's where the legacy of the fact that we didn't historically collect. We do have several fine works, paintings, sculpture by Harlem Renaissance artists, but amidst hundreds of works by other American and European artists, it can be kind of difficult to find those. So what we want to try to do in the permanent collection is build out a core Harlem Renaissance collection, so that on any given Sunday, a family out, looking for something to do in a museum can come there and see this. Or on any weekday, the student groups that professors bring through the museums, high school, college, that they will be able to easily see the Harlem Renaissance as a central presence in the permanent collections at the Met. So this is one of the things that we hope to achieve in the coming years.
Well, we're grateful that you not only invited us into an exhibit and a space, you invited us into an experience and a remembrance of that power of dignity and excellence. Dr. Denise Morel is the Merrill H. and James S. Tisch Curator at Large at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. She curated the exhibit The Harlem Renaissance and Transatlantic Modernism at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Dr. Morel, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
We'll leave you today with one final quote from a past student of today's guest, Dr. Erika Williams. Here is former Connecticut public intern, Frankie DeVivo.
The Harlem Renaissance to me resembles an air bubble enveloped in viscous liquid. It was this enlightening era of art and prosperity, but there was a precarity to it, as all that progress and joy was happening within the borders of this country, within the limits of its consciousness and capabilities, which is maybe part of why studying the Harlem Renaissance is so important today. If we forget, then we render the Harlem Renaissance and all that was accomplished inert. We pop the bubble.
Disrupted is produced by Kevin Chang Barnum, Robin Doyon Aiken, Meg Fitzgerald, and Meg Dalton. This episode was also produced by Frankie DeVivo. You can listen to all the previous episodes of Disrupted by finding us wherever you get your podcasts. And you can listen to new episodes every Friday at 9 a.m. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. Thanks for listening.